In 1867, one of the greatest real estate transactions in human history happened in the dead of night, not in a gilded palace, but in a Washington government office at 4 a.m. A Russian diplomat and an American Secretary of State shook hands over a deal that would transfer a territory larger than France to the United States for $7 million. But here's what they didn't know: buried beneath that frozen wilderness were nearly 1,000 tons of gold, vast petroleum reserves, and mineral deposits that would make this folly worth hundreds of billions in today's money. So what was Russia thinking? Why would a desperate empire sell one of its last jewels in North America? And what was the secret mechanism, the bribes, the geopolitical calculation, the near death of an empire, that made this possible? This is the untold story of how geography, ambition, and survival reshaped the modern world. The name itself reveals everything. Alaska, from the Aleutian word meaning great land. And great it truly is. We're talking about 1.7 million square kilometers stretching across half the northern Pacific. To put that in perspective, it's larger than France, twice the size of Texas, and so vast that most Americans today still don't grasp its true dimensions. Alaska is geography at its extremes. Kodiak Island, the second largest island in what would become the United States, sits in waters warmed by no sun for months at a time. The Aleutian Islands stretch for nearly 1,700 kilometers, an arc of volcanic rock and ice that would become a front line of the Cold War a century later. The continent itself is a peninsula extending 700 kilometers into the North Pacific, dominated by the Alaska Range with peaks exceeding 6,000 meters. More volcanoes sit on Alaskan soil than in the entire contiguous United States. Glaciers cover 41,440 square kilometers, an area equivalent to the entire country of Holland. But it wasn't the mountains or the glaciers that drew men across oceans. It was what lived in the waters. The indigenous peoples of Alaska, the Aleuts, Tlingit, Inupiat, and Yupik, had developed a sophisticated relationship with their environment over millennia. They hunted sea lions, seals, and whales. They fished salmon from rivers that ran thick with the creatures every season. But there was one animal whose pelt would transform empires: the sea otter. The sea otter, called Kalin in Russian, is not a large creature. But its fur, dense, glossy, water-resistant due to an extraordinary saline gland that keeps it perpetually dry, was the most valuable commodity in 18th-century world trade. A single premium sea otter pelt could fetch the price of a working man's annual salary in London or Beijing. Russian explorers reached Alaska's shores by the early 18th century. In 1732, the expedition of Mikhail Gvozdez aboard the ship St. Gabriel became the first confirmed Russian landing on the Alaskan continent. They catalogued the territory. They noted the indigenous population. They observed the wildlife. And they returned with word that would echo through the Russian Empire's merchant class: there is wealth here. For 60 years, little changed. Individual traders and adventurers filtered into Alaskan waters, hunting sea otters for Russian clients. The operation remained chaotic, unorganized, dangerous. That changed in 1783 when an ambitious Siberian merchant named Grigory Shelikov arrived with ships, armed men, and colonial ambitions. Shelikov's expedition of 1783 to 1786 established the first permanent Russian settlement on Kodiak Island. He didn't ask permission. He didn't negotiate gently with the indigenous population. By some estimates, hundreds, possibly thousands, of Kodiak and Alutiiq people died in the conflict that followed. Shelikov's brutality was efficient, it established Russian dominance. When Shelikov died in 1795, he left behind a concept: Russian America. Not a vague trading post, but a coherent colonial enterprise. His widow, Natalia Shelikova, would carry his vision forward, eventually merging it with a competitor to form, in 1799, the Russian-American Company. The Russian-American Company was chartered by the Tsar himself, given exclusive monopoly rights over all North American fur trade north of 55 degrees latitude. It was a private enterprise backed by imperial authority, a model the Russians had perfected over centuries of expansion. In 1799, the company appointed a 53-year-old former merchant named Alexander Baranov as chief manager. Baranov would spend the next 19 years building an empire. Under Baranov, Russian settlements multiplied. Kodiak became a permanent base. In 1799, the settlement of Novoarkhangelsk, which the Americans would call Sitka, was founded as the capital of Russian America. By the 1820s, there were 12 major Russian settlements stretching across the Alaskan archipelago, each one sustained by the sea otter trade. But Russian ambitions extended even further south. In 1812, Baranov sent his deputy, Ivan Kuskov, to California. On March 15, 1812, Kuskov arrived at Port Rumyantsev on the coast of present-day Sonoma County with 25 Russians and 80 native Alaskan hunters. They built a fort, Fort Ross, with wooden palisades, cannons, and blockhouses. For 30 years, Fort Ross became the southernmost outpost of Russian America, a place where Russians grew wheat, hunted sea otters, and conducted trade with American merchants. The system was remarkably sophisticated. Russian ships carried furs from Alaska to the Chinese trading port of Kyoto, where they were exchanged for tea, silk, and porcelain. Other ships sailed to San Francisco and California, trading furs for agricultural goods and supplies. Russian merchants even maintained trading relationships in Hawaii. The Russian-American company was astonishingly profitable. By some accounts that remain disputed, it was the single most profitable company in the entire Russian Empire. Annual profits exceeded 500,000 rubles while expenses ran about 1 million rubles. For a merchant empire built on fur, Alaska was the golden goose. And then, by the 1840s, the goose began to die. The sea otter's density of fur, the thickest of any living animal, made every pelt valuable but also made the animal increasingly vulnerable. Hunting occurred without management or sustainability. Russian hunters using firearms and explosives, working alongside conscripted Aleut hunters who understood the animal's behavior, killed sea otters with relentless efficiency. The numbers are staggering. From roughly 1750 to 1911, hunters killed close to 1 million sea otters across the North Pacific. By the 1840s, the animal that had built empires was becoming rare. By the 1850s, it was approaching extinction. When the sea otter trade collapsed, so did the primary revenue stream of the Russian-American company. The company began to hemorrhage money. It took on debts to the Russian state. It faced competition from other European traders and American merchants who undercut Russian prices by exploiting local hunting populations. The company tried to diversify. It hunted seals and sea lions. It exported whale fat and ice, yes, ice, cut from Alaskan glaciers and shipped in bulk to San Francisco, where ice was a luxury commodity in the pre-refrigeration era. It engaged in agriculture. But nothing replaced the sea otter trade. By the 1850s, the Russian-American company existed not as a thriving commercial enterprise but as a burden. The empire that had created it had other problems to think about. In 1853, Tsar Nicholas I, an old man obsessed with preventing the Ottoman Empire from falling apart, made a fatal miscalculation. He demanded that Russia be recognized as the protector of Orthodox Christian subjects throughout the Turkish Empire. When the Ottoman Sultan refused, Russian troops occupied the Danubian principalities. The Ottoman Empire declared war. Then Britain and France, fearing Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean and Asia, joined the war against Russia. What followed, from 1853 to 1856, was a catastrophe that would reshape European geopolitics. The Crimean War revealed Russia's fundamental weakness. Its army, despite its size, was technologically backward. Its supply lines were fragile. Its navy was helpless against modern British and French vessels. The siege of Sevastopol, the great fortress city on the Black Sea, became a symbol of Russian futility. Wave after wave of Russian soldiers died in frontal assaults against entrenched positions. The city burned. The garrison starved. In September 1855, the Russians withdrew. The war cost Russia 800 million rubles, a sum that bankrupted the state. The Russian treasury was empty. The empire had to borrow from international banks. Alexander II, who became Tsar in 1855, inherited not an empire but a financial crisis. The defeat was humiliating in ways that went beyond military loss. Russia, supposedly the great power of Eastern Europe and Asia, had been defeated by Western Europeans. The myth of Russian invincibility was shattered. The government's administrative incompetence was exposed. Serf-based agriculture couldn't sustain a modern war. Reform became not a luxury but a necessity. As Alexander II began the slow process of reform, modernizing the army, abolishing serfdom in 1861, restructuring the bureaucracy, Russian strategists were forced to confront an unpleasant question: what could Russia realistically hold and defend? A figure emerged with an answer. Count Nikolai Muravyov-Amursky was the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia, a brilliant, ambitious administrator who had spent the 1840s and 1850s quietly expanding Russian control into the Amur River basin. While the Crimean War raged, Muravyov was pursuing something more sustainable than naval battles: he was claiming territory in Asia. Between 1854 and 1858, Muravyov led expeditions down the Amur River, establishing settlements, planting flags, asserting Russian presence. In 1858, using the leverage of his negotiating position, he concluded the Treaty of Agen with China, which recognized the Amur as the border between Russian and Chinese territory and gave Russia vast new lands in Siberia. 2 years later, in 1860, he secured the Treaty of Peking, which gave Russia the Maritime Province, the region east of the Ussuri River that would become the foundation for the port city of Vladivostok. This was the future, Muravyov argued. Not Alaska, separated by an ocean from Russia's centers of power. Not a remote territory vulnerable to British expansion. But the Amur region, the Maritime Province, territories that were contiguous with Russia, that gave direct access to the Pacific, that could be defended and developed. In 1853, when Muravyov was already laying out his vision, he made a radical proposal: sell Alaska to the United States. Why would Russia sell? The logic was geopolitical and financial. First, the Crimean War had shown that Russia couldn't defend territories across the world. Great Britain had even attacked the Kamchatka Peninsula during the war, a warning that Russian possessions in the Pacific were vulnerable. Alaska, in particular, sat adjacent to British Canada. If Russia couldn't defend it, Britain would eventually take it. Better to sell it to an ally than to lose it to an enemy. Second, Britain had shown sustained interest in acquiring Alaska. The Hudson's Bay Company, a British entity, coveted Alaskan resources. Britain's expansion into Canada made Alaska a logical next target. If a Russian-British conflict emerged over Alaska, and given the Crimean War's result, Russia wanted to avoid another conflict with Britain, Russia would almost certainly lose. Third, and most compellingly, Russia had new priorities in Asia. The Amur region was close, defensible, and potentially more valuable than Alaska. And fourth, though officials rarely said it aloud, the Russian-American company was collapsing. It owed money to the state. It required subsidies and military protection. Selling Alaska would eliminate these liabilities. The proposal went nowhere at first. The Crimean War was still raging. It seemed premature. But in 1857, 2 years after the war ended, a remarkable letter crossed the desks of Russian officials. It was written by Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, the brother of Alexander II, a man with significant influence at court. This sale would be quite timely, Konstantin wrote to Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov, for one should not deceive oneself, and it is necessary to foresee that the United States of America, striving constantly to round up their possessions, and wanting to dominate individually in North America, will take the aforementioned colonies, and we will not be able to return them. Among other things, these colonies bring us very little benefit, and their loss would not be too sensitive. The logic was clear: Alaska would be taken anyway. Better to be paid for it. Alexander II, reading his brother's letter, added a note: this thought should be understood. Consultations and contacts on this matter. But consultations dragged on through the late 1850s and early 1860s. The American Civil War intervened, and Russia's position shifted again. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Russia made a decisive choice: it would support the Union against the Confederacy. This was not sentimental. Russia saw in the American South a slave power that threatened a form of modernity Russia was trying to embrace. More pragmatically, a divided America was weaker. Russian warships appeared in American ports, New York and San Francisco, in a show of solidarity that the American government interpreted as military support, however symbolic. The Russian government made no bones about its support for Lincoln and the Union cause. This alliance altered the political calculation around Alaska. If the United States was now a valued partner, selling Alaska became an act of friendship. It removed a source of potential conflict. It demonstrated Russian commitment to the American sphere of influence in North America. By 1865, the American Civil War was ending. The North had triumphed, and the United States was poised for expansion. American merchants were already flooding into Alaska, looking for furs and opportunities. American whalers worked Alaskan waters. American traders competed with Russian merchants. In the spring of 1866, the Russian government convened a meeting in St. Petersburg. Present were Emperor Alexander II, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, Foreign Minister Alexander Gorchakov, Finance Minister Mikhail Ryutin, Navy Minister Nikolai Krab, and the Russian ambassador to the United States, Eduard Andreevich Stoeckel. This was not a ceremonial gathering. This was the decision-making body of the Russian Empire. Stoeckel presented the situation with brutal honesty. The Americans, he said, had little interest in Alaska. They were focused on California and the Southern Territories. They don't give a damn about Alaska, he reported. There were significant congressional votes against the idea. But Stoeckel had a plan. First, they would launch what he called a PR campaign. They would convince the American press that Alaska was valuable, that it held strategic importance, that acquiring it would benefit the United States. Second, following the good tradition of the ancient Russians, they would distribute bribes. Emperor Alexander authorized the strategy. The price was to be set at $5 million, roughly equivalent to what the French had received for the entire Louisiana territory. Stoeckel was instructed to negotiate but authorized to go higher if necessary. In December 1866, Stoeckel sailed for Washington with his mission. On March 29 to 30, 1867, Secretary of State William Henry Seward and Ambassador Stoeckel began an all-night negotiation session in Washington. Seward, a brilliant expansionist who had long dreamed of acquiring Alaska, was eager. But Congress needed convincing. Stoeckel's initial demand was $10 million. Seward countered with $5 million. They haggled. The price crept upward: $5.5 million, $6 million, $6.5 million, $7 million. At $7 million, Stoeckel paused. He mentioned that the Russian-American company still held certain rights in Alaska. There were leases to be cancelled, buildings and equipment to be transferred. Would the United States assume these liabilities? Seward, who had already negotiated the terms carefully, refused to be saddled with pre-existing obligations. But to sweeten the deal, to show good faith, he offered an additional $200,000 to cover the company's issues. At 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867, they signed the treaty. The price, $7.2 million. Per acre, it came to about 2 cents. For 586,412 square miles of territory, larger than France, the United States paid $7.2 million. This remains partially opaque, but evidence suggests yes. According to documents and historical research, Walker, a former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Senator, to lobby Congress on behalf of the deal. The payment was significant, $26,000 in gold that came from the final purchase price. Congressional investigators later suggested that additional funds, possibly as much as $100,000, were distributed to members of Congress to secure their votes. A congressional investigation was launched, but firm conclusions were never reached. What we know with certainty, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, the powerful chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, provided crucial support. The Senate voted 37-2 in favor of ratification. A deal that had seemed dead a year earlier sailed through Congress with unexpected ease. Did bribes make the difference? Historians remain divided. What's clear is that Stoeckel's strategy, a combination of press manipulation, strategic lobbying, and direct payments, worked. Here emerges one of the most persistent myths in Russian history: Russia never received the money. According to the legend, the $7.2 million, converted to gold, was loaded onto a British ship called the Orkney, which sailed from London toward St. Petersburg. Partway across the Baltic, the story goes, the ship exploded and sank. A saboteur named William Thompson was supposedly involved. The gold went down with the ship. Russia never got paid. This narrative is almost entirely false. The payment was processed through modern banking channels. Stoeckel received a check from the U.S. Treasury. He endorsed it to a bank, Riggs Bank in Washington, which transferred the funds to the Russian bank's London office, Baring Brothers. The transaction was electronic, credit transfers between accounts, not physical gold shipments. Moreover, the Orkney sailed to South America in 1868, not toward Russia. The ship's timeline doesn't match the alleged sabotage. As for what happened to the money, Russia didn't keep it. Nearly all of the 11.36 million rubles, the ruble equivalent of $7.2 million, was spent abroad to purchase railroad equipment. Russia was building railways, the Kursk-Kiev line, the Ryazan-Kozlovskaya line, the Moscow-Ryazan line. If you ride on those trains today, you're traveling on infrastructure bought with Alaskan gold. The treaty was signed on March 30, 1867, but the formal transfer of territory didn't occur until October 18, 1867. American commissioners had to travel to Sitka, the capital of Russian America. A ceremonial transfer had to be arranged. On the morning of October 18, 1867, General Lovell Rousseau led 250 American troops in formation up to Castle Hill in Sitka. Russian soldiers, under Governor Prince Dmitry Maksutov and Captain Alexei Peschurov, stood opposite them in formation. According to the official account, the ceremony was remarkably businesslike. The Russian flag was lowered. The American flag was raised. Salutes were fired. Captain Peschurov stepped forward and, in a brief statement, said, "General Rousseau, by authority from His Majesty the Emperor of Russia, I transfer to the United States the territory of Alaska." Rousseau acknowledged the transfer. Handshakes were exchanged. That was it. No drama. No legendary flag that became tangled in the rigging, though that story persists. No emotional farewell. Just the formal transfer of empire from one power to another. Russian soldiers who had served in Alaska, about 200 of them, boarded ships bound for Vladivostok. Russian settlers who wished to remain became American citizens. A few hundred Orthodox missionaries remained behind, continuing their work converting Alaska natives to Christianity. The Russian Orthodox Church would maintain an institutional presence in Alaska for centuries. American troops took control of the territory. The frontier had moved west. The Russian Empire had ceded its last significant possession in North America. In the years following the sale, various myths emerged. Some were born of genuine disagreement about the wisdom of the transaction. Others were political narratives designed for different audiences. The most famous myth is that the Alaska purchase was immediately derided as Seward's folly, that the American public thought Seward had made a terrible bargain. Historians have thoroughly debunked this. At the time of the purchase in 1867, most Americans supported the deal. The Senate voted 37-2. The press was mixed, but many major outlets endorsed the acquisition. The term, Seward's folly, wasn't even coined until a decade later, in the 1877, by a settler commenting on conditions in the territory. The myth persists because it makes for better storytelling, the wise statesman vindicated by subsequent discoveries. But the historical record shows that Seward had made his case persuasively. Most Americans in 1867 understood Alaska's potential. In Russia, a persistent belief took root that Alaska wasn't sold outright but was leased to the United States for 99 years. According to this mythology, Russia was supposed to get Alaska back in 1966, or 1967, or 1968, depending on the version. The Soviet Union allegedly made this claim during World War II, suggesting to the Americans that Russia would not press its claim if the United States remained friendly. Stalin, according to rumor, mentioned at the Yalta Conference that the USSR wouldn't push the Alaska issue. This too is entirely unsupported by evidence. The 1867 Treaty of Cession is explicit: Russia sold Alaska outright. There is no lease. No mention of a 99-year term exists in any official document. The myth likely arose because Hong Kong was leased to Britain by China for 99 years, with the lease ending in 1997. Russian and Soviet officials, perhaps confusing the two transactions or deliberately propagating a convenient fiction, spread the idea that Alaska operated under similar terms. After the Soviet Union collapsed, some Russian ultranationalists and politicians have continued to promote the myth. In 2013, a Russian organization filed a lawsuit in Moscow Arbitration Court claiming that America hadn't paid enough for Alaska and owed additional funds. The lawsuit was rejected. In 2014, a petition appeared on the White House website demanding that the United States return Alaska to Russia. It gathered over 20,000 signatures but, obviously, went nowhere. The story of the Orkney sinking with the payment is the most elaborate myth. According to some versions, the ship was destroyed by a Confederate saboteur named William Thompson seeking insurance money. According to others, British agents deliberately sank the ship to prevent payment. As documented above, this is fictional. The money was transferred through banking channels. The Orkney sailed to South America, not toward Russia. The payment wasn't made until August 1, 1868, well after the supposed sinking date. Despite the mythology, reactions in Russia to the Alaska sale were muted. The press, when it got wind of the deal in the summer of 1867, reacted with criticism. One editor of the journal Voice, V. Krevsky, criticized the transaction sharply: should foreigners use the works of Shelikov, Baranov, Klebnikov and other self-appointed people for Russia and reap their benefits? And the public also behaves in the same way in St. Petersburg and Moscow. A saying emerged among Russian elites: they sold the tea house amber, a reference to selling Russian property to foreigners. But the criticism was ultimately contained. The Russian government kept the sale secret until November 1867, months after the treaty was signed. By the time the public knew what had happened, it was already a done deal. The government suppressed further criticism. The elite debate died down quickly. Within Russia's governing circles, however, there remained a sense that Alaska had been lost, a minor defeat in a long struggle against Western expansion. It was not seen as a good trade, despite the strategic logic. For the first 13 years after the American purchase, Alaska remained largely ignored by its new owner. A few military garrisons were established. Some trading posts were maintained. But there was no major development, no settlers flooding in. That changed in 1880. On October 4, 1880, a prospector named Joe Juneau and his partner Richard Harris, guided by Chief Cowee of the Auk Tlingit people, discovered major gold deposits in Silver Bow Basin near present-day Juneau. The strike was enormous, quartz veins laden with gold, accessible, and in large quantities. Within weeks, a mining camp had been established. Within months, the town of Juneau was founded. By the following year, mining companies had moved in. Within a decade, the Treadwell mines on Douglas Island, employing hundreds of workers, with 960 stamps processing ore, were extracting gold at industrial scale. The Juneau Gold Belt, eventually extending for over 100 miles, became one of the most productive gold mining regions in the world. More than 3/4 of Alaska's lode gold came from this single belt. The gold rush that Jack London would later immortalize in his novels was underway. Gold was not alone. In 1902, the first commercial oil well in Alaska began production at Katalla on the southern coast. The discovery was modest by later standards, but it signaled the beginning of Alaska's petroleum story. Oil would later dominate. The Swanson River field, discovered in 1957, produced 900 barrels per day. Then in 1968 came the giant, Prudhoe Bay on the North Slope, one of the largest oil fields ever discovered in North America. Beyond gold and oil, Alaska held vast mineral wealth. The Red Dog Mine in northern Alaska, discovered later, would account for roughly 10% of the world's zinc production. By the 1920s, less than 60 years after the purchase, Alaska had generated over $200 million in profits for the United States, roughly 27 times the purchase price, in contemporary dollars. By 2024, after more than a century of extraction, the numbers are staggering. Gold production totaled 49.27 million troy ounces from 1880 through 2018. In 2018 alone, gold worth $888 million accounted for 28% of Alaska's mining output. Oil revenues have been incalculable. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, has transported billions of barrels of crude. Zinc, copper, and other minerals continue to be extracted. Alaska, the territory that the Russian Empire couldn't defend and didn't want to maintain, became one of the richest land masses in the Western Hemisphere. Had Russia retained Alaska, what would have happened? The question is speculative, but the counterfactual is instructive. Russia, despite its enormous territory, has struggled throughout the 20th and 21st centuries to fully develop remote eastern regions. The Trans-Siberian Railway took decades to build. Arctic development remained limited. The Russian Far East has never matched the economic output of comparable territories under American development. It's reasonable to assume that Alaska, had it remained Russian, would have been developed more slowly. The gold rush of the 1880s and 1890s occurred because American prospectors, American capital, and American infrastructure were available. Russian merchants would have been unlikely to finance such rapid development. Moreover, Russia's political instability in the 20th century, the Revolution, the Civil War, the Soviet period, would have made consistent, long-term development even less likely. The irony is profound. Russia sold the territory it couldn't defend and didn't want to maintain. The Americans, who acquired it almost reluctantly, turned it into one of North America's most economically significant regions. The Russian-American company's collapse was a symptom of something larger, the end of the mercantilist fur trade that had sustained empires for 2 centuries. The sea otter, hunted to near extinction, could no longer sustain the business model. The Russians' monopoly on North American furs was broken. American and British competitors undersold them. The profitability that had once made the company legendary evaporated. This pattern would repeat elsewhere. The Hudson's Bay Company, which had ruled vast territories of northern North America, would likewise decline as the fur trade became less central to colonial economies. The 19th century saw empires shift their models. No longer was territorial control valued primarily for trade monopolies. Now it was valued for settlement potential, resource extraction, strategic positioning, and military advantage. By that standard, Alaska, difficult to defend, far from population centers, dominated by harsh climate and indigenous peoples, was exactly the kind of territory Russia couldn't afford to hold. The Alaska Purchase, however, revealed something about American ascendancy. The United States was able to acquire vast territories not through conquest but through purchase. This reflected American financial strength, American diplomatic skill, and American capacity for long-term thinking about westward expansion. William Seward's vision, that America should expand to the Pacific and beyond, was realized through the Alaska Purchase. Combined with earlier acquisitions, Louisiana, Texas, California, and the manifest destiny ideology that drove westward expansion, the purchase placed America on course to become a Pacific power. By the early 20th century, the United States was dominant in the Pacific. The Philippines, Hawaii, Alaska, and the west coast of the continental United States gave America naval and strategic superiority in that ocean. Russia, by contrast, had been pushed back. Its Pacific coast remained underdeveloped. Its access to Pacific trade routes was limited. The irony of the Alaska sale is that it was motivated by Russian ambitions in Asia. Muravyov's strategy, to focus on the Amur region and the maritime province, ultimately proved correct in vision but limited in execution. Russia did control the far eastern territories it acquired. Vladivostok was founded and developed as a Pacific port. The Trans-Siberian Railway eventually connected Moscow to Vladivostok. But Russian development remained slow, and Russian control of these territories faced constant pressure. Japan's rise in the late 19th and early 20th centuries challenged Russian control. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 ended in Russian defeat and loss of territory. Russian revolutionary upheaval in the early 20th century disrupted development. The Soviet period saw intensive development but also produced a region that remained economically underdeveloped relative to its resources. Had Russia retained Alaska, it would have had access to even greater resources. But the broader pattern would likely have persisted: Russian control of remote eastern territories, limited capital for development, and vulnerability to stronger powers. What if Russia had held on to Alaska? The most likely scenario is that the United States would eventually have taken it anyway. Just as the Americans acquired California, Texas, and other territories, they would likely have found a way to acquire Alaska, through war, diplomatic pressure, or gradual settlement followed by annexation. American settlers would have arrived despite Russian control. American merchants would have exploited the resources. American military pressure would have mounted. Russia, weakened by revolution, civil war, and Soviet-era underdevelopment, would eventually have lost the territory under far less favorable conditions. Alternatively, Alaska might have become a flashpoint of superpower conflict during the Cold War. American nuclear submarines would have patrolled its waters. American military bases would have ringed Soviet territory. The Cuban Missile Crisis might have had an Alaskan equivalent. By selling Alaska when it did, and accepting a relatively small price, Russia avoided all of these scenarios. It made a conscious choice, not to hold a territory it couldn't defend, but to accept payment and move on. When Russia transferred Alaska to the United States, it also transferred one of the most significant Orthodox Christian missionary enterprises in history. Since 1794, Russian missionaries had been converting Alaska natives to Orthodox Christianity. By the time of the purchase, hundreds of natives had been baptized. Orthodox churches, schools, and monasteries had been established throughout the territory. The Russian missionaries, unlike many Western missionaries, had taken the time to learn native languages and to adapt Christian practices to native cultures. Missionaries like Saint Innocent, Ivan Veniaminov, had translated scripture into Tlingit and other native languages. They had trained native men as deacons and priests. When America took control, the competition for native souls intensified. Catholic and Protestant missionaries arrived from the South. Some native communities converted to these new denominations. Others remained Orthodox. Today, Alaska has the largest concentration of Orthodox Christians in the United States, a direct legacy of Russian colonization. The Sitka Cathedral, built during the Russian period, still stands and serves the Orthodox community. Dozens of smaller Orthodox chapels and churches, built by Russian colonists and maintained by their native converts, dot the Alaskan landscape. It's one of the most enduring cultural legacies of Russian America, not in politics or economics, but in faith. When the transfer occurred, approximately 200 to 400 Russians and Russian-Alaskan Creoles, people of mixed Russian and native ancestry, were living in the territory. About 200 of them boarded ships bound for Russian territory. But several hundred remained. They became American citizens, often reluctantly. Many assimilated into American society. Their descendants live in Alaska today, scattered through the population. The term Creole, used in Russian colonial contexts, referred to people of mixed heritage. These Creoles had often served as intermediaries between Russian traders and native hunters. They had also married into native families, creating extended kinship networks that bound communities together. Their descendants, while no longer primarily Russian-speaking or Russian-identified, carry genetic and cultural legacies of Russian colonialism. Place names throughout Alaska, Sitka, Kodiak, Yakutat, preserve Russian linguistic traces. The sale of Alaska marked the end of the Russian Empire's North American adventure. It had lasted, depending on how you count, between 75 and 150 years. It had generated enormous wealth for merchants and the state. It had created a colonial system that, while hardly benevolent, had produced cultural and religious legacies that persist. Russia would never again attempt North American colonization. Its attention, its capital, its military focus remained on Europe and Asia. The Pacific, for Russia, became a peripheral concern, important strategically but never central to Russian identity or power in the way the Atlantic was for Britain or France. For Alaska, the sale represented a transformation. From a remote Russian colonial territory with limited development, it became an American frontier with rapid growth, settlement, and resource extraction. The territory that Alexander II had sold for $7.2 million to avoid the costs of defending it transformed, over the course of a century, into one of the most strategically important regions in North America and one of the most resource-rich territories in the world. So was it a folly? A strategic masterstroke? A pragmatic surrender? The answer is all three, depending on perspective. For Alexander II and his advisors, the sale was pragmatic. Russia couldn't defend Alaska. Keeping it was economically inefficient and strategically risky. Selling it, for whatever price they could get, freed resources for priorities in Asia and for internal reform. For William Seward and the United States, it was a masterstroke. Acquisition of a vast territory, larger than France, for a trivial sum, with enormous hidden wealth, was an exceptional bargain. It positioned America for Pacific dominance. For the Russian Empire's merchants and investors, it was a loss. A profitable enterprise was liquidated. Future wealth was surrendered. For the Alaska natives and Russian Alaskan Creoles, it was a pivot. Russian colonial rule, with its orthodox missions and traders, gave way to American rule, with its settlers and resource extraction. The transition was chaotic and often destructive. For history, the Alaska Purchase represents a moment when empires measured their interests coolly and made calculated decisions about what they could afford. Russia chose to retreat from North America. America chose to expand further into the Pacific. In doing so, they reshaped the hemisphere. The Cold War would later turn Alaska into a frontline. The modern economy of resource extraction and petroleum would make Alaska central to American energy policy. The Orthodox Church's missionary legacy would persist in a small corner of an American state. All of this flowed from a negotiation that lasted 14 hours, concluded at 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867, in a Washington office. $7 million changed hands. Two empires shifted their priorities. And a vast, resource-rich territory passed from one power to another, the greatest real estate transaction in human history.